My son laughed. Dad, honestly, keeping this entire company from zero. You just worked for other people your whole life. I set down my fork and looked him dead in the eye. Then let Frank pay your mortgage. I'll stop. Daniel's smile disappeared. His wife Rachel went completely still. And from across the table, my son's father-in-law, Frank Holloway, just stared at me like I had pulled a pin out of a grenade. I'm glad you're here with me today. I want you to stay until the very end, and when you're done, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. My name is Walter, and I'm 64 years old. I spent my career as a union electrician in Columbus, Ohio. I rewired old houses, crawled through attics in July heat, worked double shifts on industrial sites when the overtime was available. Not glamorous work, not the kind of work that gets written up in business magazines, but honest work. And for 36 years, it paid the bills. My wife Carol died 6 years ago from a stroke, fast and without warning on a Tuesday morning in October, the kind of death that doesn't give you time to prepare or say the things you should have said years earlier. She was 57. After she died, I sold our house in Clintonville, the one we'd lived in for 22 years, and moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side. I told myself it was because the house was too big for one person. That was only partly true. My son Daniel is 36. He's a good-looking man, smart in the way that makes other people feel slightly inadequate, the kind of person who always knows the right thing to say in any room. He married Rachel Holloway 3 years after Carol died. Rachel is fine. She's not warm, exactly, but she's not cruel either. She's the kind of woman who keeps score without ever showing the scorecard. Her family, though, her family is something else entirely. Frank Holloway built a regional trucking company out of a single vehicle he drove himself in his late 20s. By the time Daniel married Rachel, Frank owned a fleet of 63 trucks, employed over 200 people, and lived in a 6,000-square-foot house in Dublin, with a pool, a home theater, and a wine cellar he gave tours of at every family gathering. His wife Beverly was the kind of woman who asked about your car before she asked about your health. They were not bad people. They were just people who had decided that net worth was the primary unit of human measurement, and by that measurement, I had always come up short. The dinner where everything came apart happened on a Sunday in April. Daniel and Rachel had invited both families over for Easter. I drove 40 minutes in my 2014 Silverado, which has a small rust spot above the rear wheel well that I keep meaning to deal with. I brought a pie Carol used to make, apple with a brown sugar crust, made from her handwritten recipe card that I keep in the drawer next to the stove. When I walked in, Frank was already holding court at the head of the table, talking about a contract he had just signed with a regional distribution company. Beverly was nodding at everything he said like she was watching a performance she had seen many times but still found impressive. Rachel was in the kitchen. Daniel met me at the door with a hug that felt slightly performative, the kind of hug you give when other people are watching. The table was set with dishes I didn't recognize, obviously expensive, the kind you register for at a store that makes you feel underdressed just walking through the entrance. The house itself was in Powell, a suburb that had been cornfields when I was young. 4 bedrooms, 3.5 bathrooms, a great room with ceilings high enough to make you feel small. My grandson Cooper, who is 4 years old and the best person I know, ran to me from the living room and grabbed my leg. That was the only uncomplicated moment of the entire evening. We sat down. Frank said grace, which surprised me because I had never heard him mention God outside of this context. The food was good. Rachel is a capable cook. For the first 30 minutes, it was a normal Easter dinner, the kind where everyone is on slightly formal behavior and the conversation stays in safe lanes. Then, Frank started talking about expansion, a new terminal in Dayton, another possible acquisition in Cincinnati. His son-in-law, my son, nodded along with the enthusiasm of a man who had been thoroughly converted to someone else's religion. Daniel, Frank said, leaning back in his chair, is going to be managing the Dayton operation once we get it off the ground. Daniel's chest visibly expanded. Rachel squeezed his hand. I smiled across the table because I was genuinely proud of him, whatever complicated feelings I had about everything else. It was Beverly who said it first, but Daniel who finished the thought. Beverly said, almost to herself, but not quite, that it was so wonderful that Daniel had married into a family with real drive. Real drive. She said it the way you'd say real furniture, as opposed to the imitation kind. And Daniel, my son, my boy, the one I taught to ride a bike in the parking lot of Bexley Methodist, said, with a laugh that was more Frank's laugh than his own. Dad's always been different. He was never really built for that kind of ambition. Frank built his first truck route at 32. Dad was still punching someone else's clock at 60. I heard Cooper in the other room stacking wooden blocks. I heard the refrigerator hum. I heard my own heartbeat with unusual clarity. I thought about the number I had been looking at that morning before I left for dinner. The number I had carried in my chest for 4 years like a stone I couldn't set down. $3,400 a month. Their mortgage. $1,400 in student loans. Daniel's master's degree in business administration that he needed to impress Frank enough to get the job he now had. $800 a month for Rachel's car, the lease she said they couldn't quite cover when the payments started. $600 utilities. That was $5,200 a month. $62,400 a year. For 4 years, $249,600. All of it coming from the account I had set up after Carol died, funded by the sale of our house, by her life insurance, by 36 years of watching every dollar, punching someone else's clock, I said, and my voice was quiet enough that the table went still. Everyone looked at me. I took a sip of water. Daniel, I'm going to stop paying your mortgage next month. I'm going to stop covering Rachel's car lease. I'm going to stop with the utilities and the student loans. All of it. Frank can take over. Clearly he's the better provider. The silence after that was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Beverly's fork hovered halfway to her mouth. Frank sat forward slowly in his chair. Rachel looked at Daniel with an expression I could not entirely read. Part shock, part something else. Something that looked almost like a question she had been waiting to ask for a long time. Daniel's face had gone through several colors in rapid succession and had settled on a pale, careful blankness. Dad, Daniel said, what are you talking about? You know exactly what I'm talking about, son. I stood up, took my jacket from the back of the chair, and kissed the top of Cooper's head on my way to the door. I looked back once. Frank Holloway was staring at the table. For the first time since I had known him, he had nothing to say. Daniel called me at 10:30 that night. I was sitting in my apartment reading, or trying to read. Dad, he said, and his voice was different from Easter dinner. Younger, somehow, less rehearsed. What did you mean today? I knew what he was asking. He wasn't confused about the words. He was confused about whether the words meant what they clearly meant. I got up and walked to the kitchen and stood at the counter under the light. Your mortgage payment is $3,400 a month, I said. It comes out of an account I set up after your mother died. Automatic transfer on the 2nd of every month. Daniel was quiet for so long I thought he might have put the phone down. That's not possible, he finally said. We pay our own mortgage. We have it set up through our bank. What's the account number on your statement? Another long pause. I'll have to look. Look now, I said. I heard drawers opening, file folders, the sound of paper, then nothing for almost 2 minutes. Dad. His voice had changed again. What account number is this? It's mine, I said. It's been mine for 4 years. He made a sound I hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager, low and unsteady, the sound of a floor giving way. What about the car payment? What about the loans? All of it coming from the same account. 4 years. $62,000 a year. Say the number out loud, Daniel. $249,000. He said it slowly, like he was reading it off a wall. More or less. The house sold for more than we paid for it. Your mother's insurance helped. I've been careful. He didn't say anything. I could hear him breathing. Rachel came into the room. I could tell by the shift in the acoustics. A door opening. Footsteps. A whispered question from her. Daniel covered the phone for a moment. Then he came back. Did Rachel know? He asked. I told him I didn't believe so. He was quiet again. Then, did my father-in-law know? That was the question I had been waiting for. I told him I wasn't certain, but that he should look carefully at the conversations he'd had with Frank when they were first setting up their finances after the wedding. Think about who suggested which accounts. Think about whether Frank ever mentioned the mortgage specifically. Think about whether Frank was ever too incurious about how 2 people on their salaries maintained that house and that life. He hung up 20 minutes later. He said he needed to think. I sat back down with my book and didn't read a single word. 3 days went by. On the 4th day, Daniel showed up at my apartment without calling first. It was a Wednesday morning and I was on my 2nd cup of coffee. He looked like a man who had not slept in the way people look when they've been awake, not from anxiety exactly, but from thinking. The specific exhaustion of a mind that has been working very hard on something it would have preferred not to examine. I let him in. He sat at Carol's kitchen table, the old pine one from the house in Clintonville, the one with the water ring from a pot I set down wrong in 1999 and never fully stopped feeling guilty about. He ran his hand across the surface the same way Lillian had run her fingers across her mother's table in a story I had never heard and never would, but the gesture is universal. It belongs to everyone who has ever understood that some objects carry more history than others. He said Frank knew. He had gone through every financial conversation he'd had with his father-in-law going back to the wedding. Subtle things. Frank asking what their monthly overhead looked like and nodding in a way that suggested he already knew the answer. Frank never once asking how they afforded the house on Daniel's salary from a job Frank himself had given him at a salary Frank himself had set. Frank mentioning once, about 2 years into the marriage, that it was wonderful to have a son-in-law from a family that understood the importance of support. That word, support. The way a man uses a word when he knows its full meaning and is watching to see if you do. I poured him coffee. He wrapped both hands around the cup the way people do when they need something to hold. "Dad," he said, "why didn't you tell me?" I looked at my son and I thought about Carol, about the night she sat in this same chair after Daniel's first divorce from his college girlfriend, the one that lasted 14 months and ended badly. She had told him that night that the most important thing in any life was to know what you were actually standing on. Not what you thought you were standing on. Not what someone had told you was there. What was actually there when you looked straight down. I told him what I told myself for 4 years. That when he married Rachel, he had finally seemed happy in a way that was new for him. Settled in a way the years after his first marriage hadn't been. That I didn't want to poison that happiness with obligation, with the weight of what I was doing. That I kept thinking another year, one more year, and then he would be established enough at Frank's company that they would be genuinely fine on their own. That I had been waiting for a day that kept not arriving. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, and I will remember the exact words, "Dad, you've been eating peanut butter sandwiches." I looked at him. "There's nothing wrong with peanut butter sandwiches. Mrs. Okafor down the hall told me," he said. "She told me she brings you soup sometimes." She didn't need to tell him that. But Mrs. Okafor is 71 years old and has no interest in keeping secrets she thinks are harmful. I had lost 28 pounds over the past 2 years. I knew it. I had not wanted anyone else to know it. The mathematics of my situation were straightforward. My pension covered my rent, my utilities, my groceries at their most basic, and not much else. I had been drawing down the account for Daniel carefully, trying to keep enough buffer that it wouldn't run dry before he didn't need it anymore. Some months were tighter than others. Mrs. Okafor's soup on those months had been, I will admit, more than neighborly. My son put his face in his hands. He stayed that way for a while. I sat across from him and did not say anything, because there are moments when speaking is the wrong choice, when silence is the only honest response to a truth that is still settling. He looked up eventually. He told me that Rachel had found the documents, that she had really looked, at their finances for the first time since the wedding, because Daniel had asked her to. He said that when she found the account numbers, she had been very quiet for a long time, and that her quietness was different from usual. Something had shifted in it. He said she had then spent 2 hours on the phone with her own mother without telling Daniel what they discussed. He said Frank had called him that morning and asked if they could all meet this weekend, that it was important, that they needed to handle this as a family. Handle this as a family. I told Daniel what I thought that meant. I told him Frank Holloway was not a man who had built 63 trucks by losing negotiations, that the meeting he was proposing was not a conversation. It was a settlement offer dressed in family language. I told him to be careful. Daniel said he knew. He said he had known something for a long time that he hadn't let himself look at directly. He said the job Frank had given him had always felt slightly too convenient, the salary slightly too calibrated to their lifestyle, the opportunities for advancement always slightly conditional in ways he could never precisely identify. He said he had chosen not to see it, because seeing it would have required him to ask a question he wasn't ready to answer, which was, what exactly had he built, and who had actually built it? He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. He set it on Carol's table between us. Property records, he said. Business filings. Frank's company had annual revenues of $4.3 million last year. Richard, Rachel's brother, who worked for the company, had a disclosed salary of $190. Daniel's own salary, which Frank had presented as generous, was $68,000. The family trust, which Frank had mentioned at least a dozen times as being tied up and not easily accessible, had distributions of $30,000 per quarter for the past 3 years. To Frank personally, I looked at the numbers. Daniel watched me look at them. His father-in-law had been receiving $120,000 a year from a trust he had told everyone was inaccessible, while allowing my retirement savings to fund his daughter's lifestyle, while accepting at every family dinner the narrative that he was the successful one, and I was the one who had never quite had the drive to build anything. There was a watch, Daniel said. He found it in Frank's desk when he went looking. A receipt from a jeweler in Short Hills, New Jersey, $41,000, purchased 14 months ago. The same month their furnace had broken, and Daniel had mentioned to Frank, almost in passing, that the repair quote was higher than they had budgeted for. Frank had said not to worry, he would make sure things were covered. 3 days later the furnace was fixed. Daniel had thanked him. He had not known the money had come from me. I stood up and walked to the window that looks out over the parking lot of my building. Mrs. Okafor's car was there, a green Honda that is older than it should be for a woman her age to be driving alone, but she is fiercely uninterested in anyone's concern. I had fixed her windshield wiper motor in October. She had brought me a pot of jollof rice. This is the economy of people who do not have trust funds. Daniel came and stood beside me. He said he was sorry. I told him what I meant, that I was not angry with him the way he was afraid I was, that I understood how a person can choose not to see what would cost too much to see, that his mother had told me something similar about her own family years ago, that the willingness to look directly at a difficult truth was not something people were born with. It was something they had to decide to do. I told him I thought he had decided. He asked me what came next. I told him that was his decision, not mine. He had a son. He had a marriage that was, by his own account, now standing on different ground than it had been a week ago. He had a job with a company owned by a man who had spent 4 years treating my retirement account like a line item on a family budget he hadn't bothered to mention to my son. Those were the facts. What he did with them was up to him. He said he needed a week. I told him to take what he needed. The meeting at Frank's house happened on a Saturday. I drove out to Dublin in the Silverado, the circular driveway, the 3-car garage, the kind of landscaping that requires a service rather than a weekend afternoon. I had been to this house a dozen times for various family occasions, and I had always felt the specific smallness that expensive houses are sometimes designed to produce in visitors. I did not feel it this time. Frank had arranged the living room like a meeting. He sat in the large chair near the fireplace. Beverly was on the sofa. Rachel sat beside her. Daniel stood near the window. He met my eye when I walked in. He looked like a man who had made a decision and was not going to move off it. Frank stood and offered his hand. I shook it because I am 64 years old and I was raised to shake hands offered in good faith. I sat in the chair, Daniel indicated, across from the Holloways. Beverly said she was so glad we could all sit down together like family. I did not respond to that. Frank said he wanted to start by expressing the family's gratitude for the support I had provided over the years. He said it the way executives say things, with a tone designed to make the listener feel that an acknowledgement is the same as a resolution. He said there had perhaps been some miscommunication about the nature of the financial arrangement, that in his experience these things happened in families and the important thing was to find a path forward that worked for everyone. Miscommunication, I said. Frank looked at me. A miscommunication would be if one of us thought we were talking about one thing and it turned out we were talking about another. This wasn't that. You knew exactly what you were talking about. Beverly shifted on the sofa. Rachel was looking at the floor. Frank's expression moved through several calculations very quickly. He said, carefully, that he had always understood the arrangement to be temporary and voluntary, that he had never pressured me in any direction, that he had simply allowed me to express my love for my son in the way I had chosen. I looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at his father-in-law. You allowed me, I said. You allowed a man who was eating 1 meal a day to fund your daughter's life while you bought a $41,000 watch and told my son your trust was inaccessible. Frank, I have never in my life used the word allowed about something I was quietly doing to a person who trusted me. Rachel stood up. She said, Mom. And Beverly stood up, and they both left the room. Frank and Daniel and I sat in the remaining silence. Frank was looking at his hands. Daniel was looking at Frank. My son said, I'm resigning from the company, Frank. Frank's head came up. Daniel, don't be hasty. This is a difficult moment for everyone. I've been building towards something here, toward your eventual partnership, toward a real future in this business. The company is yours someday. Yours and Rachel's. You know that. Daniel said, I know what you told me. And I know what you didn't tell me. And I know that a position built on my father's retirement savings is not something I can stand in with any self-respect. The room was very quiet. I thought about Carol. I thought about how she had once told me that the most important thing she ever saw me do was apologize to a homeowner for work that wasn't my fault, simply because I thought someone should and no one else was going to. She said that was the moment she understood exactly who she had married. Frank made 2 more attempts to reframe the situation. Both failed. The second one involved an oblique reference to Cooper, to the stability of a home environment, to what upheaval might mean for a 4-year-old. Daniel said, with a steadiness I had not expected, and was proud of, in a way that went somewhere deep, that Cooper's stability was exactly why he was doing this, because he refused to raise his son in a house built on a story. Rachel came back into the room alone while we were still sitting there. She sat down on the sofa, not beside her father but at the far end, and she looked at Daniel. She looked at him for a long time. Then she looked at me. She said, Walter, I'm sorry. I want you to know I didn't know. Her voice was even. I believed her. I told her I did. She said she and Daniel had talked for most of the previous 4 nights. She said she had asked her father directly, twice, and that what he had said and what he had not said had told her what she needed to know. She said she was not going to pretend she understood yet what her marriage needed to look like going forward, but that she was not going to pretend the past 4 years had been something other than what they were. Frank's face was a landscape of a man who understood that the structure he had built had shifted in a way that could not be repaired in an afternoon. Daniel and I left together. We stood by our cars in the circular driveway. He asked me what I was going to do. I told him I was going to go home, take a shower, and call Mrs. Okafor to see if she wanted me to look at her passenger side mirror, which had been loose since February. He laughed. It was a real laugh. The first one I had heard from him in a week that didn't have something strained underneath it. Then he said, Dad, I need to tell you about a conversation I had on Tuesday. I listened. He had consulted a lawyer, a friend from his MBA program, who had gone into family and civil law. The lawyer had reviewed what he had brought him, the financial records, the documentation of the payments I had made, the discrepancy between Frank's stated income and the lifestyle the family had been living, the evidence of the trust fund distributions. The lawyer had said that while the situation was complicated, there were grounds to pursue recovery of a portion of the funds, particularly given that Frank had been an active participant in concealing the arrangement from Daniel, had directly benefited from it, and had made material misrepresentations to Daniel about the family's finances throughout the marriage. It would take time, the lawyer said. It would require Daniel's cooperation and Rachel's decision about her own legal position. It would not be the full $249,000. But the lawyer's preliminary estimate, based on what he had reviewed, was that somewhere between $80,000 and $110,000 in recovery was realistic if they pursued it through civil court, and that Frank's lawyers would likely prefer to settle quietly well before that. I looked at my son in the Dublin driveway. He looked like himself, more than he had in some time. He looked like the boy who helped me reroute a circuit panel in the basement on Clintonville when he was 14, and decided at the end of it that he wanted to understand how everything worked. I told him it was his call. He said he knew. He said he was going to pursue it. He said whatever recovered I chose to accept was mine, and whatever I chose not to accept he would hold in trust for Cooper's college, so that Cooper would go to school on money that belonged to the family that loved him. That was 7 months ago. Daniel and Rachel are in a 2-bedroom rental in Worthington, close to a school Cooper will start next fall. Rachel is working part-time at a dental practice, something she had done before the marriage and had let go of when Frank made it clear he thought it was unnecessary. She seems different now, steadier in a way I had not seen before, like a woman who had been told a long story about herself and had finally decided to write her own. They are in couples therapy. Daniel told me this without embarrassment, which I respected. He said it was hard and useful, which is what I would expect. The legal matter settled out of court 11 weeks ago, $94,000. It is sitting in an account. I have not decided yet what to do with most of it. I did one thing. I drove out to the house on Clintonville, the one Carol and I had lived in for 22 years. The new owners have repainted it a color we would not have chosen. The garden where Carol planted her tulips every October is gone, replaced with a stone border and low-maintenance shrubs. But the oak tree in the backyard is still there, The one with the branch Daniel fell out of when he was 9 and broke his wrist and cried only a little because he was trying to be stoic. And Carol had said, "You don't have to be stoic with us, sweetheart. We're your parents." I sat in the truck in front of that house for a while. I wasn't sad exactly. I was the kind of quiet that comes after something long and heavy has finally been set down. Last Saturday I had Daniel and Rachel and Cooper at my apartment for dinner. I made pot roast in the slow cooker, Carol's recipe, the one that takes all day and fills the whole apartment with a smell that is the olfactory equivalent of being forgiven for something. Cooper sat on the counter and helped me stir things that did not strictly require stirring, because he wanted to be involved, and I saw no reason to exclude him. After dinner, while Rachel did the dishes over my objections and Daniel read to Cooper on the couch, I went to the small wooden box on my dresser where I keep things that matter. Inside, beside Carol's watch, which stopped 6 years ago, and which I have never had the heart to have repaired, was a folded piece of paper. I had found it in the kitchen drawer in Clintonville the day we sold the house, tucked inside the cover of Carol's recipe binder in her handwriting, a note she must have left at some point and never mentioned. It said, "Walter, if you are reading this without me, I want you to know that the best thing I ever built was the same thing you built, and I want you to know it will last longer than you think." I folded it back up and put it in my shirt pocket and went back out to my family in the other room. Cooper was asleep against Daniel's arm. Rachel was laughing at something Daniel had said, a real laugh, the uninhibited kind. The apartment was warm. It smelled like Carol's pot roast and my son's presence and the specific rightness of being exactly where you are. I sat in my chair, the one I've had for 15 years with the armrests worn smooth, and I thought about the dinner in Powell in April, when my son called me the kind of man who had never built anything. Every single thing I love was in this room. I had built all of it. Sometimes the most powerful thing a man can build has no address, no balance sheet, no name on a contract. Walter never owned a fleet of trucks or gave tours of a wine cellar, but he built a son who chose honesty over comfort, a grandson who preferred dinner with Grandpa to a swimming pool, and a table where real love was served every time. That is the kind of wealth that outlasts everything else. A small note for you. This story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you a moment of entertainment and, hopefully, leave a little warmth in your heart along the way.